as we look at the work of God in our lives, a lot of times we learn more about God from the rearview mirror than we do from the windshield. It's a country western song, but it expresses the thought. I thank God for unanswered prayers. And sometimes things that we're really focused on and we really hope will happen and will take place, they don't. But then at some point down the road, we look back and we think, oh, you can see the hand of God in ways that we never could see and comprehend fully at the time. The other thing that we just want to do very quickly by way of review is that it's just of great interest to me that Pilate puts the expression, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews," in the three major cultural languages of the day. So if you can read Aramaic, which is kind of the local language in Palestine, if you can read Latin, and if you can read Greek, then whatever capacity that you have to read, then Pilate wants you to know, this is the King of the Jews. He has no idea that he's doing this, but isn't this interesting that even the person who crucified Jesus is contributing to the spread of the gospel? And he's doing it out of contempt that they have forced him to do this, but even in putting the inscription up on the cross, it's going to be in the three major cultures and languages that are current in Palestine at that time. And as we've noticed, as Saul becomes Paul, then he speaks Aramaic, because when Jesus says to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" he speaks to him in Aramaic. He's a Roman citizen and claims that privilege, and something either father or grandfather had done allowed the family to be that. And he dictates his letters in Greek. And the culture of Saul of Tarsus as he becomes Paul, to me, is an interesting kind of echo of the news on the cross written in three languages. Then as Dr. Luke unfolds the story of the growth of the church, then he's going to follow that same pattern in that the gospel will be taken to the center of each of those cultural backgrounds. Begins in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. As we've seen, it goes to Athens in chapter 17. And then before we end the book of Rome, the book of Acts, then Paul's going to be in the city of Rome. And there's this continual blending of these three cultures that Pilate announced the crucifixion in the inscription on the cross. Those are the cultures of Paul, and this will also be the unfolding of the story of the book of Acts. The one verse that we're going to come back to a couple of times is that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2, and you'll read in the first three verses, I came to you with much fear and trembling. And I want to just let that soak in for a second. I came to you with much fear and trembling. It's easy for us to look back 2,000 years later and assume, and I don't know how you want to see this mentally, either these guys just kind of had this course where they started and they just moved upward. And what we see, especially in the Apostle Paul, is that there are times of just dark despair. And he will even say, at certain times, I even despaired of life itself. And a part of the reason why that's so important is that to me is much more realistic about the experience of being human than you start at a certain point and life is just this gradual incline toward, fill in the blank, toward maturity, toward heaven, toward going home. And all of us at different times have to deal with different levels of either fear or anxiety. In Saul's case, it's going to be extreme persecution. And that to me is a very important part of the background of both Luke's account in Acts and what we're going to find in 1 Corinthians, and just kind of let that soak in for a second. I came to you with much fear and trembling. Let's read the first 11 verses of Acts 18. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And I want to say this again next week in some more detail. We've touched on this. The date of this event is 49 AD. And in the same way that just the opening section, Lord willing, next week is Gallio as proconsul of Achaia, is going to be in 59. And as we said, the dating of many of the events of the New Testament are done before and after this event. We get lists of, this person was ruling, this was going on, but here's a specific event in Roman history that we can date to 49 AD, and so the dating not only of Acts, but much of the New Testament comes from this particular passage. And so Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. We will touch again on this as well. The word tent maker is obviously a very appropriate translation, but the term also could have to do with leather worker. And probably, well, let me do it the other way. I have a dear friend, Chuck White, who can just fix anything, but he has that leather belt that he puts on, and when he's on a ladder hanging onto something, he can reach down and knows exactly where every tool is. And you've seen these guys do this. It's absolutely amazing because they know where every little tool is and everything else. If you are traveling 10,000 miles across the Mediterranean, it's going to be hard to carry the material to make tents from. I mean, you can buy it in a local situation, but you could work as a leather worker, and if you start thinking belts, shoes, any kinds of things with leather, and you have that pouch with you, you know what I'm trying to say, that tradesman thing. And Jewish boys were always taught to have a trade. And this is going to become an enormous sense of conflict because in the very elite educated, and both Greeks and especially Romans, tradesmen were, well, let me say it the other way. People who worked with their hands were looked down upon by certain levels of society. And as you come into 1 Corinthians, what's going to happen is that Paul is going to continue to work as a tradesman and will not take their money. Bill and Claudia would be familiar with Mary's Market. Flea Market, 23rd Street. Yeah, it's what he said, his dad's home away from home. And you imagine these cultural elite people being embarrassed that here Paul is fixing shoes and belts at Mary's Market on Saturday. You kind of understand what I'm trying to say? And so for those kinds of people, this was not a good thing. Even into the second letter, and again, this will come up in a different context, Paul will say, I may not be a trained speaker, however, I do have knowledge. And the term that the Corinthians used for Paul in his preaching, and listen very carefully, this is an original word, but you'll hear it, I-D-I-O-T-E-S. Let me spell it again. This is a Greek word, but you're going to get, it's a little bit different, but just think about this. I-D-I-O-T-E-S. And idiotes is an amateur where we expect someone who's polished. And so there were certain Corinthians that were embarrassed when Paul was preaching on Sunday because some of their friends might come, and here was this karaoke guy where you expect someone to be kind of polished and knows what he's doing. And so there's going to be enormous layers of conflict that are going to take place, but at the heart of it, Paul would rather work with his hands and feel free to preach the gospel in all of its truth than be restricted by taking people's money and then being patronized by people that would put him in an awkward position. We worked with a church that it was originally South Walker and merged and became Southern Oaks while we were there, while we were in college. And the man's name, his first name was Dick. Part of it may come back. He was a salesman and worked close to the Gold Dome Bank on 23rd and Classen. But this man had 4 to 5 home Bible studies every night of the week. And he, being that part of Oklahoma City, he met people, and he went all over Oklahoma City doing home Bible studies, and it just taught dozens and dozens of people. The elders asked him to come and just do a presentation on doing home Bible studies. And I have never hurt so bad and felt so sorry for anybody in my life. He had a half glass of water and a knife. These were the 1950 Jewel Millers with crew cuts and ponytails, and he would clank this glass every once in a while. I'm sweating a little bit. He would be completely sweat through. He would use 2 or 3 handkerchiefs. He just suffered and suffered and suffered. Have you ever been to a wrestling match and then the next day you're sore because you've done this and you've done this? And by the time he got through, it was painful. The elders let him keep going, and I wasn't going to say anything, because, obviously a good man with a good heart, but this was the most painful public presentation I have ever witnessed in my life. Guess what happened? 4 of the men decided if that old boy can do it, anybody can. And it had just the exact opposite effect, because if Raymond Kelsey or Hugo McCord would have come in, these old boys would have said, well, I can't do that. And this poor guy getting up and stammering and sweating, and, I'm from the farm. I can take a lot of stuff, but when a guy just takes a half glass of water and every once in a while goes clank with a knife, and then you turn the thing over, it was the most unprofessional presentation I have ever seen in my life. But how did God do that? For 20 years, these 4 guys would say, I don't visit the hospital, I don't visit the sick, I don't do this and this. We do home Bible studies. And what's going to take place is that Paul's appearance in Corinth was such a contradiction of what they expected, because the cultured Greek expression was, how you say something is as important as what you say. And so Paul comes into this city with much fear and trembling, and guess what? God has brought Aquila and Priscilla to the city because the emperor has evicted them from Rome, and he meets lifetime friends, and they are partners in trade. And we're going to find over and over and again that they work together, they help each other, they're a part of this. And again, here's the providence and the work of God. He comes to this city in fear and trembling, and God brings him into the house of Aquila and Priscilla. And you look over and over and again, God is working in our lives and in Saul's life in ways that he could never have understood. So, 18:4, he reasoned in the synagogues every Sabbath, and he tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed him and reviled him, he shook out his garments and he said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And what's interesting is that as Acts unfolds, all of those early encounters, especially on the first missionary journey, this opposition takes place, and they rally the troops and run him out of town. And what we're going to find from Philippi to Corinth to Ephesus, then Paul is going to go more and more to Roman centers. And being a Roman citizen, he will get different political and personal protection in a Roman colony than he will in the average town. And so even though he is evicted from the synagogue, notice what takes place. He left there in verse 7, he went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. And here are these God-fearers. Cornelius was one of these, and Luke disperses these all through the book of Acts, that yes, there were Jewish people, but here was this group of people that had come to know, either they had friends, they came to the synagogue. Some people were converted through coming to Thursday adult reading school and reading Genesis, but these God-fearers are a very important group of people in Acts. But here's the irony. His house is next to the synagogue. And I read this and I just laugh. You know, same type thing. You come to the city in fear and trembling, and in the past you have been kicked out of the synagogue and stoned, or they're pursuing you and doing all this other stuff, and you're just harassed and harassed. And in one sense, if you get used to being harassed, it's a whole different thing to just to be ignored, as he was in Athens. Those of us that played football in small towns, that was a very important part of our lives. And my senior year, the last game, nobody in front of me, everybody in the line were hurt and nobody was in the original position. So you call a play and have to tell three guys what they're supposed to do, and you're just trying to survive. And our last game was with Frederick. We're walking out in the field, and our coach had played tackle for Navy, this huge guy. And we're walking on the goalpost, and he puts his arm around me, and he says, son, he said, you need to keep your heads up tonight because these may be two of the finest defensive ends that we've played all year long. So if you played quarterback, you're used to getting stepped on, used to getting spit on occasionally, just all this kind of stuff. These guys were absolute gentlemen. They would be in your face, knock you down, and then they would help you up and dust you off, and then very quietly say, see you next play, buddy, and slap you on the back end. And they were men of their word. That messes with your mind totally different than someone stepping on you. You're not used to that kind of courtesy by guys who are attacking you and knocking you down. And they would take turns picking you up, kind of pat you on the back. We'll see you next play, buddy. You see what I'm saying? That just, you're not quite used to that because you're used to the other. And so here Saul is used, as it becomes Paul, he's used to being persecuted, sometimes stoned, sometimes beaten. And then he goes to Athens, and it's kind of like, we don't know all the reasons why, but you get to thinking, oh, he comes to Corinth with fear and trembling. And so how does God work with him even during his weakest moments? And anticipate this from the Corinthian correspondence. He says, when I am weak, what? Then I am strong, and I would kind of add in my mind, in the Lord. And that's why it's really important that when we get tired, when we get frustrated, when we get down, that we don't quit. One more thing, and we'll do this reading. One of my favorite teachers had this expression, and for those of you who've played 42 or hearts or spades where you have a partner, he used a spiritual analogy, and he said, spiritually, if you're playing, don't ever fold your cards because you never know when God's going to trump the next hand. And if you played spades or 42, you may have a terrible hand, but your partner may be able to have that play to kind of keep you in the game. And I think about that because at different times we all do either get tired or we get down or we get frustrated. And I hear Everett saying, you know, in a spiritual life, when you get tired and weary, don't fold your cards because you never know when God may trump the next hand. You look at the success, and it's going to be success in a major way, of the planting of the church in Corinth was not because Paul was at his best. He just flew in. Everything went according to plan. And because of his wonderful ability and power, the church was planted. In fact, it's just the opposite. Because he went in weakness and through the preaching of the gospel, then God worked through his weaknesses and provided strength and help, particularly from Aquila and Priscilla. And this whole church is planted. and this whole area is going to eventually be evangelized, can I say virtually in spite of and not because of his strengths. And that to me is a really, really important lesson because, like I said, none of our spiritual lives is just going to be this straight incline and going up. And we will all have these valleys. We'll all have these times where we struggle with different things. And I just think the planting of the church in Corinth is one of those wonderful object lessons for all of us to realize, looking back, Saul's going to see, oh, God was doing this and God was doing that. And I get kicked out of the synagogue, and guess where we start meeting? Next door. So people didn't have to get a GPS, didn't have to get a map. They didn't have to know, we're meeting next door to the synagogue. And you see what I'm saying? Over and over and again, the planting of the church in Corinth is the evidence of the working and the providence of God in his life. So Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, and together with his entire household. So you think about the earthquake. I'm talking about culturally. Here's a real earthquake. It would be like one of our elders leaving the church here to become a Mormon. Claudia, can you imagine Bill ever becoming a Mormon? we just can't even hardly go there. And for some of these Jews to think, oh, you were the ruler of the synagogue, and now you're meeting next door with this group of outcasts. And just the shocks that have gone through the entire community and his whole household and many other Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. The Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will harm you to attack you, for I have many people in this city. And he stays for 1.5 years. And that's something we're going to end with today, because at different times we're intimidated into silence. And maybe you've had the same experience. Sometimes I've left a situation and said, I really shouldn't have said anything. It'd been better if I just hadn't made any comment about that. And other times I've left and said, something should have been said. And what God is telling Paul is, don't let fear prevent you from speaking and saying the things that need to be said at the right time. Don't be afraid. Do not be silent. I'm with you. And you'll find that Crispus is one of the people that Paul baptized. So we're going to look at the church in ancient Corinth. And if you have an outline, this is on the back page, and we'll go through quite a bit of this quickly because you can read most of this. The ancient city of Corinth, going back when Athens was flourishing in the 400s or whatever, is 40 miles west of Athens. And Athens is next to the sea, and so they were a port city. But as you go inland about 40 miles, there's like an isthmus where there's land on both sides, and then this huge peninsula is on the bottom, and Corinth was right at that point. And so if you were going into southern Achaia, southern Greece, then you went through Athens, you went through Corinth, and you had seaports on both sides of the city. For years, they had a series of rolling logs that they could drag small ships across the isthmus rather than having to sail all the way around. And so if you just think of a port city that has seaports on both sides, that is at a very, very strategic location. Rome is going to fight what is known as the Punic Wars against Carthage. And this is going to be over a century. And the first one's going to take place from 264 to 241. And then the second one begins in 218. And if you've ever read anything about Hannibal, Hannibal went along North Africa, crossed at Gibraltar, went through Spain, came over the Alps with elephants, and lived in Italy for nearly a decade, and they never did actually defeat him. And they finally decided what we need to do is cross the Mediterranean and attack his home city, and maybe they'll call him home. And that's how they finally got him out of Italy. They never did defeat him. And people doing military strategy will still be studying Hannibal to this day, Second Punic War. The third one was when the Romans finally won. And the significance is this: we're 146 BC. Rome finally conquers Carthage, and as they typically did in an enemy city, burnt the city down, all this other stuff. While that's taking place, there's also a second war taking place in Greece. And in the same year, 146, ancient Corinth and ancient Carthage both are destroyed. So Corinth is going to be basically in ruins for a century. 44 BC, Julius Caesar comes along and refounds Corinth. It becomes a Roman capital. And one of my teachers said this. He said, the cultural ghosts of a century before were revived, and the party continued. All through ancient Greece, when a playwright talked about a Corinthian, they would be drunk, they would be profane, and they would have these Greek plays. And you could hear the Corinthian coming from the side of the stage, and he would be loud and he would be drunk. And so a city is destroyed a century later, and kind of like the Las Vegas of the ancient world, picks up again. And so this has been the state of the city before Paul comes. The other thing that's going to be significant is that Greek culture is going to be imported into the city of Rome. And like, for example, artifacts from Corinth, artifacts from Syracuse and other places. And in time, by we get into the first century, the Romans had adopted so many of the Greek cultures and the Greek items. It's just of interest to me. Paul writes to the church in Rome, and he writes in Greek. And this is a part of the influence. And one of their poets just simply said, conquered Greece, took captive her savage conqueror, and brought her to rustic Latinum. And there's a lot more that could be said, but we'll leave it with that. If you turn to the next page, this becomes of interest in terms of the work and what took place within the church in Rome, in Corinth, sorry. Look at this description. Paul's going to say, this is who you were. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. And just think about this. These are the practices of the people who are worshiping in the church in Corinth. And look at the list. The sexually immoral, the idolaters, the adulterers, the men who practice homosexuality, thieves, greedy, drunkards, revilers, swindlers. None of you will enter the kingdom of heaven. And here it comes. Such were some of you. And this is what's significant, is that in one of the most immoral places in the Roman Empire, then God plants the church in Corinth. And notice the process. You were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus. And so when you look at the nature of what is going to take place, then Paul again is being encouraged to go to this place. Don't be afraid. Speak up. And this just strikes me as very interesting. We have more chapters devoted to the problem children in Corinth than anyone else in the New Testament. You may have had the same experience. I've had parents tell me we had 4 kids, but we spent more time on one of them than we did the other 3 together. Hopefully that wasn't one of you, but you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes there's just children that just require more time. And then you look, here's 16 chapters, 1 Corinthians, 13 chapters. And I sometimes ask, what would our New Testament be like if we had 1st and 2nd Philippians? And through the Spirit, God chose to give us more information about the problem church. But here's what I always think about. Would there be any place in the empire that needed the church any worse than Corinth? And you may be like me. Sometimes we look at a person and think, well, wouldn't they be a good Christian? And then do we look at other people and don't think the same thing? And the very people that some people would never have thought would become Christians do this, and that's a part of the nature of God working in the church in Corinth. If you look on the back page, Paul's job description was very simple. He's a servant, he's a witness. He is to open their eyes, to turn them from darkness into light. But this is 4:4 on the back. 1 Corinthians 1:26. Consider your calling, brothers. Not many were wise, according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful, and not many were noble. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. And God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not. So the gospel is going to come to Europe through the Macedonian call, and I just want to touch on this word again. Howard Norton pointed this out the first time I saw it really clearly. He said, the word concluding is there. He sees the vision, and then they have to get together and decide, this is what God wants us to do. And so they cross the isthmus, they go across the other side, they begin, and they'll be in Thessalonica and Philippi and Berea. But when the Macedonian call was given, Paul could never have seen himself in Athens, could never have seen himself in Corinth. And look at how God continued to work with him and through him, even in ways that he could never completely have understood. And it was a blending of the vision of God and the conclusions that people meet. We'll talk about these wonderful people later, but Aquila and Priscilla, we're going to come across them 6 times in the New Testament. And when I think of this couple, I think of 2 things. If the church is there, they're going to strengthen the church. And if the church is not there, the church starts when they move into town. And just reflecting upon this week, I thought about this. If you're despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, I'm talking about Jesus, as one whom people hide their faces from you. Isaiah 53. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be in the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus for a while? My first job was in Childress, Texas. There was no room in the inn, no place in town to stay. So they put up a list on the bulletin board, can I come live with you for a week? You talk about getting to learn at church. I've got a green bicycle and 3 cardboard boxes, and so if you'll come get my cardboard boxes and give me your address, I'll ride my bicycle to your house. Well, I go to this lady's house out on the farm, and she says, we're glad you're here, son. And here it starts. You can track mud in on your feet. You can put your feet on the furniture. You can leave grass burrs on the couch. But, son, when you're through eating, the dishes go in the sink. Am I understood? I said, yes, ma'am. That was the one rule in the house. The dishes go in the sink. But if you're homeless and you don't have any place to stay, that's a small rule to have to follow in order to, and these people just became beloved friends because we lived with them. And you think if you're Jesus, birds of the air have nest, foxes the holes have ground, and what? The Son of Man has no place to lay his head, except when he's in the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, he can go, that's what Aquila and Priscilla are for Paul. Here he is, a walking scar, beaten, stoned, and is still going to continue. And at the lowest point of his life, God brings these people of fellow trade, fellow heart, and we don't know what this was, but he says in Romans 16, they risked their lives for me. And at his lowest point, God provided help that he never could have anticipated. So, don't be afraid, I'm with you. Do you remember the term for Emmanuel? God with us. Matthew 18, you go to talk to someone who's out of duty, I am with you. How does Matthew 28 end? Behold, I am with you. And the Great Commission given in word by Jesus is given in person to Paul and those who were with him. So, I've mentioned this. I love the Corinthians because they were the people that most people would not ever assume became Christians. They'd come the furthest out of the darkness, the deepest out of the world, and they're going to have the most problems, but they're an example that the gospel can change people's lives and no one is too hard. So 2,000 years ago, Paul hears what? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to speak. I have many people in this city. And I think if God had people in the city of Corinth, he has people all around us if we'll be not afraid and speak out.